Else Marie Pade was, you can say, peculiar personality. She was actually a peculiar person, and she had this way of being in the world, which was around having fun first and foremost. But she was also a very distraught person, and she was also a person who, in a way, tended to have a kind of a low self-esteem, and that's perhaps why she developed so much sense for humor. And because we laughed a lot while we were together, but she was still, she was in doubt whether anyone thought that her music was any good. And I think that was, I would say, a sorrow of her life, that her music was not valued more internationally.
You're listening to the New Music Podcast. I'm Jennifer Torrence, and today I will be speaking with the musician and musicologist Henrik Marstal about the Danish electronic music pioneer Else Marie Pade. Pade's life is one marked by tragedy, but most of all by her resilience and her totally unique voice. But like so many women, her work was nearly lost to history. Thanks to people like Henrik, Pade's music was rediscovered in the early 2000s, and had she been alive today, we would be celebrating 100 years of her life. Henrik will tell us about her life story and some of the ideas that drive her work, and in particular, we will be focusing on her 1958 work, Symphonie Magnetophonique, which we will be showing in Oslo on October 18th, and her work from 1970, Face It.
My name is Henrik Marstal. I'm an associate professor at one of our conservatories in Copenhagen. It's called the Rhythmic Music Conservatory, and it's a conservatory for the study of contemporary popular music, you can say. I met her in 2001, made this article, and me and three, four, five other young persons, we were musicologists or electronic musicians, at the time, we became friends with her in a way, and met her, talked to her, had coffee with her, and went to concerts with her, and discussed all what was happening around her. And then I made a biography about her in 2019, and that which came out in Danish. And then right now I'm in the process of ending the work with another biography, which will come out on Bloomsbury in the United States in New York in 2025, next year. She was, to some extent, a person who wanted to make music on completely her own terms. And the reason why this is the fact is that she had a very, I would say, a very long and a very lonely childhood, confined to a bed several weeks a month. She had this kind of permanent disease which kept her to her bed, and she was the only child, so she was very alone in that bed. And she developed a very strong sense of listening habits, listening to everything around her, every kind of sound, and by telling what she heard, by what she heard, she actually developed or invented her own stories. She got this kind of ear as an elephant because she was alone, and she used her ears as a kind of a resource for actually finding out how to handle with that situation, being in bed. And she developed this kind of very strong inner sound worlds, which is a little bit comparable to what Hélène Radic, the French electronic composer, has told about, that he also had this habit of developing strong inner sound worlds. And this is apparent to a fact where Else Marie Pade once said that her best working period in her life was when she was around 6 years old, before she entered school. And that's a crazy thing to say, because perhaps presumably she didn't even know that there were composers and you could be a composer. But still, that's how she said it. That was the strongest working period of her life. And the interesting thing is that when electronic music came around, first musique concrète, the musique concrète movement in Paris in the early 50s, and a few years later, the electronische musique movement in Germany. When they came around, she found out that for the first time in her life, she heard music which was in a way relatable to the inner sound worlds she had had herself. And she found a way of making these sound worlds heard through the medium of electronic music. So that's a very strange approach to being a composer, and very typically she's not a professional trained composer. She had quite a lot of compositional training, but that was on a private basis. She had an education from the Conservatory of Music in Copenhagen, the Royal Conservatory, but that was in piano, so that was not about composing. But the reason why her story is so interesting is that she happened to be one of the young persons in the 30s in Denmark who were hit very hard by the jazz craze or the swing craze, who came to Denmark like so many other countries. And that was actually her thing. But she was also playing classical piano aside from that. And then, as you know, Denmark was occupied by the Nazis in 1940. And a lot of young people resented that very much and wanted to do a difference, wanted to fight against the Nazis. And she also did that. And she started out in the year 1943 at the age of 18 years. And then in January 1944, there was a killing in Denmark of a very famous writer and priest, Kai Munk. He opposed the Germans from the church, and he wrote plays for the Royal Theatre and other places where he actually had this kind of agenda that he was against the Germans. So, and he was quite popular. So the Germans said he shouldn't be around anymore. So that they killed him, and that killing aroused so much anger in Denmark against the Germans. And after that killing in January 1944, the resistance movement got new blood. And one of those persons happened to be Else Marie Pade, who at the age of 19, she still lived at her parents. She slept with a gun under her pillow. She learned how to transport explosives. She learned how to dismantle machine guns, things like that. So it's crazy that you could be able to do that in that young age. And then she was caught one night. The doorbell rang, and it was Gestapo, and they brought her to the Gestapo prison. And then she later came to the Frøslev camp. Just like in Norway, we had a few prisoners camps in Denmark, and one of them was called Frøslev. It was situated just a few kilometers north of the German border, but as you can tell, in Denmark. And it was made by the government because they knew what was going on in Germany with the concentration camps, and this was a way of hoping that Danes would not go to Germany to those camps, and to a large extent, they succeeded in doing that. So the story about Else Marie Pade is that she starts out her life as a jazz aficionado. Her parents will not let her go into the realm of music because they don't think she should be a musician at all, which she wants to. She is called by the Germans. While she is with the Germans in the prison, she promised herself that if she survives all this, she will actually go into music no matter what her parents say. And she also has a kind of a paranormal experience in the prison where she looks out of the prison window and she sees a star, and that star activates a kind of a situation where she sees and hears all the figures and all the sounds from her childhood. And she also hears a melody, a jazz melody, and she decides, or she finds out that she's not alone, and that someone would be there to help her, and she shouldn't be afraid. So after that experience, everything turns out to be much better for her. And then there's a funny story about that jazz melody is actually, she had written music before, but that jazz melody is actually a kind of a signal to her that write more music. And she hasn't got any sheet of paper, of course. So she actually writes the part of the melody on the prison wall. She makes a staff, and then she writes the melody, and And that's so symbolic that that's what she did, because I'm actually, you can say, amazed by the fact that during the very weeks when Pade was writing this on the wall, another girl at exactly the same age was writing at a wall in a Gestapo prison in Poland. But that was a prayer: Mother, please be with me. Please don't be mad. I want to be with you. It's a kind of a Catholic prayer to Maria, which was made by this young woman who miraculously survived the Second World War, just like Else Marie Pade did. And the reason why I mentioned this poem on the wall is that that's the very poem which Goreski used as one of the movements for his Third Symphony from 1976. So there's a kind of connection between young women being caught by Gestapo, writing on the wall, and surviving, and the writings is actually having an afterlife. The song which Pade wrote on the wall was never released. Actually, other of her songs were released as jazz songs, popular songs after the war, but not this one. It was not released until 2005, where she made a kind of a small piano song cycle with songs she had written during the war, during the occupation. And when that happened in 2005, commemorating the 60 years jubilee of the liberation of Denmark, then people learned about that story, about that song, and the song was recorded and has been recorded several times since. So that's part of the unusual thing about Else Marie Pade, that the inner South world, the relation to the resistance movement, and then also that she actually became a quite, I would not say famous, but quite renowned composer of electronic music in the 50s and 60s in Denmark. And for some years, she happened to be the only one. And she managed to do a lot of works, which were premiered in the radio. And around 1965, things changed for her, and she began to make less music. And she sort of disappeared out of the public discourse, and no one actually talked about her anymore. So she had around 30 years from, I would say, around 1970 until 2001, where no one talked about her or thought about her. And then suddenly this interview I talked about before made sure that she was rediscovered. And because of this story, she was back in business very fast.
One of her most celebrated works is the 1958 tape piece, Symphonie Magnetophonique, which is a kind of sound collage where she combines field recordings that she processed, a la musique concrète, to tell a narrative from a particular point of view, which perhaps it's hers, but it's a certain person's journey traveling through Copenhagen across 24 hours. And the sound world is a kind of dreamlike, fantastical one where you hear doors opening and closing, and on the other side of it, his sort of rhythmicized city life, but also sounds that are a bit more difficult to place. How did she make this piece?
Else Marie Pade's work was to a large extent collaborative works with a small group of trusted peers who were engineers at the Danish radio, or electronic technicians. And this was not unusual. A lot of electronic music composers at the time had kind of assistants helping them with doing what they did. But still, the difference was that Else Marie Pade was not even really allowed to touch the machinery, because she hadn't any education in that. She worked at Danish Radio as a producer, but so she had access to the institution, but she was not able to really touch anything. So she had to tell the engineers what to do. And this is one of the foundations for the making of Symphonie Magnetophonique. There was especially one technician, he's called Svend Dren Knudsen. He actually was the one who made all these sounds come true, but at the basis of what Else Marie Pade told him to do. And The work is to a very large extent a symphony which describes one day in the life of a person from early morning to early morning, 20 minutes, and describes that day via the medium of sound. And that's why opens with the sounds of birds. We can tell it's in the springtime or in the summer. We start with the sound of birds and sounds which tells us that this is in the mind of someone who is sleeping. And then we have a clock that the bells which are ringing because you need to wake up. And then you have all these kind of morning ritual things, going to the bath, singing in the bath, drinking coffee, and then leaving the house, going down the stairs and go to work and so on. And the inspiration for this piece could have come from James Joyce Ulysses, the novel, which was translated into Danish, I think in the late 40s, in 1948. The book is from 1922, and James Joyce was a writer which, in intellectual circles, also of Denmark, which Pade belonged to. She was a vivid reader. She knew Joyce, and other pieces, other works by Joyce had been translated into Danish by that time. And then finally, Ulysses came in 1948, and Else Marie Pade has said that she read the book in 3 days. She was so immersed with it and so occupied with this piece. And that book describes the day in a life of one person of 24 hours as well. So that might be the idea. And then there was a Danish reference in the 30s. We had the composer Bernard Christensen and a librettist Sven Møller Christensen. They made a jazz oratorio, they called it, called De 24 timer, the 24 hours. And it was about a school class, about having lessons in school. And it was a jazz oratorio made for performance by school classes all over Denmark, and it was very popular. And Pade made this piece when she was a child, and I'm sure that always also had a kind of impression to her, gave an impression to her. We also had the piece by Luciano Berio, the electronic Italian composer, called Omaggio a Joyce, which I'm sure she also knew about. So there was a kind of reference part there. But when she made the piece is made by the use of musique concrète sounds of all kinds, and some of them were at hand at the the sound archive at Danmarks Radio, because they had a lot of different sounds being used for radio drama, and they also recorded a lot of sounds which they had to use out in the street or even in the studio as well. There's a famous sequence of the brushing of tooth, which Pade did herself, and that sound they couldn't find anywhere, so they had to record that sound. And then you have this, as you said, this kind of dreamy world, because of course it's relatable sounds. You can hear what they are, but the sounds are still only representations of real things. So they're kind of double-sided things to the sound, that they are what they are, and they are not what they are. And I think that's very typical Else Marie Pade, to have a kind of rendition of real life and then anything else but real life. And I think that's actually very interesting. For the sequences for the nighttime, for the night, you have the only, I would say, really abstract sounds is coming here, and that's the sound of falling bombs. And of course, this is not to say that there was war in Denmark or anything. It's because I had this impression that this is because the person who's being portrayed have had something to do with the war, which was 13 years ago at the time the piece was made in 1958, that this person might have some nightmares about the war. And I think that's why we had these sounds as well. So I also think it's interesting that the musique concrète idea was about finding real sounds, which were of course recognizable, and then doing things with them, trying to manipulate them by means of electronic machinery and other things. So you can actually have a sound of, for instance, you and I talking together, and then you can actually process the sounds so much so it ends up sounding like rhythm or anything else. It didn't have to sound like people talking. But Else Marie Pade in Symphonie Magnetophonique, she made sure that every sound recorded was actually put onto tape in a very recognizable way. And so the idea that you could use sounds and make them show the everyday world, but not being recognizable anymore, that was not what she wanted to do at all. And some would say to a certain extent, she misunderstood what Musique Concrète was all about. But I would still say that Piazza Fair also had a very strong interest in showing sounds as it were, as we know from his music as well. So she did only one side of what Schiffer showed. She didn't use the whole palette, but she used at least a part of it.
The first time I heard this work, I was struck by how fresh it sounds. Sometimes I hear turntablism, and sometimes it grooves extremely hard, and there's a mixture of genre and aesthetic strategies. It's useful to know that she comes from jazz. That really gives a lot of meaning for the way she uses rhythm. And I also was struck by, when I re-listened to it ahead of this talk, was the last 5 minutes of the piece, where you hear someone say over and over, "Mornavisa, Mornavisa," morning paper. And at the same time, you hear the sound of military sounds, bombs dropping, and then sirens.
Mornavisa, Mornavisa.
And it hit me harder this time because of the state of the world now and the state of war in the world and this pattern of waking up every day and opening the newspaper and seeing what horrors happened overnight. So again, I feel this piece on a musical level is as fresh as if it were made today. Of course, we would use different tools for those sounds, perhaps. But then also thematically, it's unfortunately as prescient as ever.
I think that's a very good observation, and I think it's very interesting. Some people have been a little bit confused about the word morgenavisa, meaning morning papers, of course, which were sold on the street at that time. You could buy newspapers, yeah, on the street, and but they were prepared so you could buy them already around midnight, even though they were papers for the next day. So, and at least you could do that in Copenhagen, where the papers usually the newspapers were of Denmark were printed, and then they were transported by train, I assume, to other parts of the country. So if you were in Aarhus, where Else Marie Pade grew up, you would not be able to do this because you couldn't get newspapers before perhaps 5 o'clock in the morning. But in Copenhagen you could. So that's why the word morgenavisa is there at the last part, actually a little bit before the nightmare sequences. But I think you're right that those two things together is actually telling us something. You can have nightmare yourself about the war, and when you wake up in the morning, you can go to the internet and find out what has happened. So it's actually exactly the same thing. I really think it's a good point. I also would say that Else Marie Pade had a very developed sense of humor, and you feel this humor in much of her music. She insisted on that music making and music listening should be fun. So she made these kind of sometimes a little bit grotesque scenarios, and you pointed to the rhythm as part of it, and I would say that she heard things being repeated and said to herself, "This is funny, so let's do it a little bit ad absurdum." Then it becomes even more funny, so we can hear what's actually going on. It's a kind of a small ballet being exposed for our ears. and I want to a kind of auditive ballet, and I want to show that. So there's a lot of humor going on, I would say, in this piece, and you have this a lot of things, a lot of small things. There's a waltz, for instance, for the you have a seabird saying a sound in the middle of the piece, and then you have a dog barking, and it's made in a waltz, in a rhythmic waltz. It's a woo 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 woo, and that is actually, I would say, it's quite funny idea that you have two animals actually working together in a medium of a waltz in a fixed tempo. So she has this idea that the craziness of the world. She wanted to show that if you actually go a little more further yourself as a listener and obviously as a composer, you can actually portray a sound world which is very, very funny and a little bit absurd.
You mentioned that in 1970 she basically disappeared from the world. What happened there?
I think it was not that surprising in a way, because no one was really around her to stand up for her work. Not really. She was to a large extent alone as a composer, and she complained that being a woman, it was hard being a composer because, as you can tell, a lot of people didn't feel the necessity to take her just as seriously as anyone else. Her music was reviewed to a large extent in the way that when she made a new piece, it was premiered in the radio, and then the following day or the day after, it was reviewed in the newspaper. So she was taken serious as a composer of that kind. And I would say that many of these reviews took her serious, no matter that she was a woman, but a lot of people didn't. And you also have reviews which or interviews which has a lot of, you could say, today you could say there's a lot of sexist implications. And the whole question of how can you be a wife and a mother and still think that you can be a serious composer? That was actually a thing going on all the time. And actually, there were only two female composers in the 50s in Denmark. So she was very much alone. Then she seeks this kind of, unity, or she made you can say bonds with other female persons in Denmark, but that was people doing other things, manuscript writers, instructors, but she actually had a thing of looking after female collaborators all of the time. So that was her way of doing things. But what happened in the mid-60s, she had to do more work as a producer at Danmarks Radio and had less time to compose. And she also things became harder for her, and it pointed towards a place in her life in the mid-70s where she had a mental breakdown and was forced to stop working as a producer. So she was forced to go on pension and retire. And she was not forced by her employer, but by a doctor who said to her, "You're not able to work anymore." And that's because she developed what was at the time called the KZ syndrome, or KZ syndrome, concentration camp syndrome. It's a kind of a post-traumatic stress disorder, of course, a PTSD, kind of, you can say, kind of uh, state of art in your mind where you can't do anything proper for a long time. And it turns out that in the early to mid 70s in Europe, a lot of people experienced this at the same time, which can be strange, but it turned out that if you have been under an extreme mental and perhaps even physical pressure in a certain part of your life, and you don't talk about it afterwards, and you don't relate to it afterwards, then your mind will have at its disposal a period of around 30 years where you actually can stand the pressure afterwards. And then you actually break down. And that's what happened to her. It's very tragic, but still she managed to get a kind of a decent life, I would say, but still as a retired person, she composed very, very little. But she was not really able to do much about her music or for her music, and there was not many people doing that. She had a little bit kind of support we had an organization in Denmark called Kvinder i Musik, which was, as the name says, it was a small organization trying to raise the awareness of female composers, arranging concerts, panel discussions, making the Danmarks Radio interested in what was going on, making interviews with female composers. They did a lot of good things, and they also interviewed Pade and had her music performed, but not that much. So the reason why she sort of disappeared was that no one was really there to support her music. But also, I think one reason was that the electronic music of the 50s and the 60s were not really around that much in the 70s and 80s. Other things were happening, other things were around. And that meant that this was a kind of music from a little bit older music history, which wasn't something people had to listen to.
You just reminded me of her work from 1970, Face It, which is perhaps the most concrete case where she's clearly processing the trauma of World War II and what she experienced. Can you say something about this work? When I listen to it, I hear an almost Reichian, "it's gonna rain," repetition of the same phrase that's said over and over and over again, and this phrase being, "Hitler isn't dead. Hitler isn't dead," and then processing this material.
I må se i øjnene. Hitler er ikke død. 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 Hitler er ikke død.
Well, that's actually one of her most interesting works, even though it's also one of her most, you can say, simple works in terms of its only three components. There's a mass drum just banging out in quavers, doom, 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 which is interesting because the snare drum is of course the drum from the jazz music, but also from the rock music. But it's also originally the sound you actually went to war with. It's a sound of war drums, and then you have this narrator who's actually repeating the words that you said. Hitler is not dead. Almost all the time, we have to face it. Hitler is not dead. That's more or less what that voice says a lot of the time. And then we have some small samples of distorted sounds, which almost sound like an angry dog barking or something, but it becomes longer and longer during the piece. Those samples, we have them, from time to time, and it turns out it's a man shouting. And if you hear more and more, it turns out that it's the voice of Adolf Hitler. It's from some of his speeches made for the German population. So in the end of the piece, you hear some people applauding and cheering, and that's actually Germans who had listened to Hitler. So that's just actually so interesting. You had the Hitler's not dead, and then you had the sound of Hitler being who comes more and more alive as a dictator you should be aware of. So even Hitler is not dead. I find this to be very interesting because the piece itself was actually an anti-Vietnam piece. Someone in Danmarks Radio got the idea of putting 4 composers and 4 poets together. And Pade was put together with a Danish poet called Orla Bundgaard Poulsen, who was, and as you might know, the anti-Vietnam war movement was very, very strong in Denmark. And there was a lot of people who actually resented this war very much, and he was one of them. And knowing that Richard Nixon, who was president at the time in the United States, he was actually the man who did not stop the war. He could probably stop the war, but he wouldn't. So the poem is about Hitler is not dead. We have to face it. He still lives on, and he lives in Nixon. So that's what actually the words are about. But of course, the words Hitler is not dead, it sort of triggered something in Else Marie Pade, I would say, being a person who had paid such a high price because of the what Hitler did. And also in 1958, there was a very, very heated debate in Denmark about electronic music. Denmark Radio, one of the channels at Denmark Radio, made a whole electronic music week where a lot of music works were premiered. And two of the works you mentioned by Else Marie Pade was premiered here as well. It was in April 1959, the Symphonie Magnetophonique and the Syv Cirkler, Seven Circles. Both of them were premiered here. And that week ended with a panel discussion with some Danish music personalities discussing things. And one of them was at the time, very famous composer in Denmark, Knud Aage Riisager, who later happened to be the principal, or who had become the principal of the Royal Danish Conservatory. So he was actually he had one of the, you can say, heaviest positions in the Danish musical life. And he said from that position that he resented electronic music very, very much. He couldn't find any point with it. And then he said, this music reminds me about the speeches of Hitler. And I assume that this must have hurt Else Marie Pade very, very much, because she was actually, paid the price. And you can always think if Knud Aage Riisager, the composer, knew that Pade actually had been at the Frøstavlejr. We don't know, but still, it's actually so wild that that's what he said. So I see the piece as a kind of a revenge piece. She took the power back and she said, okay, let me tell you about Hitler. If you don't think anything about him, and you say this music sounds like the speeches of Hitler, well, then I show you what music would sound like the speeches of Hitler could sound like. So there's actually this discrepancy in the piece, that it's actually about Nixon, but because the Hitler is not dead, it's repeated so many times, I think more than 100 times in the piece, you actually find out that it's about Hitler very much. And then we have two editions of the piece. The original edition, which came out in 2002 on a CD, which Else Marie Pade herself oversaw, where the piece about the one line saying he lives in Nixon, it was actually cut out. But when it was made again, released again as a digital release by the Cabo Records, the record company, in 2022, it was back again. So then there we have the he lives in Nixon thing. But it's a kind of, it's such an eerie piece, and to me it points, you said it reminds you about Steve Reich and the repetitiveness of the same small words being said, and I think that's to a large extent true, but still I don't think Pade knew much about Steve Reich at that time, so it's not relatable. I think the eeriness of the music is, to me, more relatable to the music of the industrial music pioneers in Throbbing Gristle, who in the late 70s made this so eerie musical work on 3 or 4 albums of the late 70s and early 80s, which is kind of a, you can say, a rendition of the Western civilization going down. And that music is so, to me, very, very hard to listen to even today, where so much else has happened within music. But still, the musical eeriness is so strong and profound in this piece. And I think for a reason, it has become one of her, you can say, most listened to works.
Thank you so much, Henrik, for sharing these stories and your perspectives, and for all the research you've done to take care of her and her work. It's a huge gift to the field. So thank you, and thank you for talking.